How are you?
Very well,
So Joshua, is it?
That's correct.
Hey, welcome. Thanks very much for giving us the time. We thought that you're the researcher and author, so great. We thought we'd come straight to you to get some insights into it. So we have had Callaghan come here and talk to us about this, and just simply as the Select Committee for Economic Development, we want to improve our understanding and be over some of these subjects like this. So it's essentially a briefing for our benefit. Cool. All right. So why don't you go through maybe some of the points? How long have we got? 20 minutes. If you could leave a good maybe 5 to 7 or whatever for questions, that would be fantastic. But just talk to us about your work and what you've written.
Yeah, cool. That was exactly my thinking as well. I was thinking more like 5 to 10 minutes of me talking and a bit of just, hey, what do you most want to know about? So mostly I'm a programmer, entrepreneur, educator. I've spent the last 5 years training programmers and doing a lot around growing the tech workforce. And so I spent about 4 months last year researching blockchain in New Zealand, overseas, and really looking at it from an opportunity point of view, like what does this technology present as an opportunity for New Zealand? And I think from your point of view, one of the main things I would think about is that the European, I think it's like Science and Energy and Industry Committee, categorized this as a general purpose technology. And when you look at a general purpose technology, it means something that's going to impact all of the economy in a country or the world. And it's usually for things like electricity, the internet, mass production kind of things. So things which are very radical and disruptive. And it's very early stages. It might not be a general purpose technology, but there's a fair chance it will be. And so I think that's the main thing, that as a potential new general purpose technology, paying attention to it and understanding and orientating around it is kind of, it's a tricky thing to do. And that's the space I think we're in at the moment. There's a whole bunch of stuff about how blockchain works, and I don't think you need to worry too much about that. The main thing I would think about is that it's a way of architecting computer systems where the only way to break the rules inside that system is to break the whole system itself. So it's a little bit like if you were going to break the law of speeding or whatnot, the only way of doing that inside this system is if you break the whole law around speeding and the whole system which enforces that law. You can't just tweak outside of it. So what this means is that if you think about how people usually transact in computer systems, say a bank, for example, usually you've got a computer system where there are rules about what you can and can't do. I can't spend your money. Inside of this system, inside these systems, the way you normally enforce I can't spend your money rules is you create a trusted institution like a bank and someone who is an intermediary for that system as a whole. And whether that's Facebook or Uber or Airbnb or banking systems, there are people in the middle who basically act as the enforcers for the rules. And what this technology allows is for people to build systems and deploy and run systems without having that central trusted intermediary, so that you can have confidence I'm not spending your money without having any bank in the middle. And so it's a very, I guess, radical and powerful disintermediation force. And if you look at the role of disintermediation in the economy, where you're essentially cutting out the people in the middle, that can be a big way of gaining efficiencies, a big way of democratizing access. And I think that's the potential and the reason why so many people say, hey, this is going to touch everything. Because when you look at the types of applications people are building with this technology, it's touching every industry. And it's really early stages and it's all sort of noisy at the moment. But that's, I guess, that would be the main point, I'd say, to understand the role of this technology. Do you want me to just keep talking and have questions at the end? Cool.
Yep.
I think one of the like close to home sort of opportunity, or not close to home, but like more closer in time opportunities is around reducing economic friction. So if you think about the cost of implementing anti-money laundering, the new stuff that's going through in New Zealand, and the reports estimate at like $1 billion of economic energy needed to implement that this is a technology which has the potential to dramatically decrease that, particularly in the way you start to say if one person has made an attestation about someone's identity and you can use them as a way of referencing it. So instead of having to do your own verification of someone's identity and position, you can, in a secure way, trust someone else's attestation. That's the sort of opportunity which in the next couple of years could make a significant impact in New Zealand. And I think that's just one example of what I would call the use case of reducing economic friction. So places where there's inefficiencies in markets and the way things work. I think that There's another really interesting way of thinking about it as people involved in government and whatnot around when you need to, markets tend towards inefficiencies and injustice in a way that you can have a sense of people build up market power and that distorts the whole market. And governments as a whole try and do little interventions or big interventions and get it right and get it wrong to try and keep markets efficient and working for everybody. There is the potential of this technology to have a tempering effect on monopolies in the market so that their impact of distorting the markets can be reduced. So this is where I'd start to say it gets more into economic theory and political things and whatnot, and that's fairly deep subject to dive into. But if you were going to focus your energies, I would start to think about how can this technology, by its nature, temper the effects of powerful market forces such as Facebooks or TradeMe's or Uber's or Airbnb's, where the systems tend towards a monopoly impact. They start out quite friendly, and then when they get established, they start to extract from the market significantly and bring inefficiencies in and reduce innovation and that kind of thing. So a way of tempering monopolies is a useful line of inquiry. And I think the other point I would say, and this is the more emergent and speculative part of it, but my sense is that there is a fair chance that we are witnessing the birth of a new type of organization. And that if you think about the 1600s and you try to explain limited liability companies to people and shareholding and directors and whatnot, it wouldn't make sense and you wouldn't have much language for it. But I think that there is a possibility of a new form of organization emerging because of this technology, which will be as impactful and as significant as limited liability companies. And there's a whole bunch of details I can go into what those organizations could look like. And that's at the more sort of long-term impact side of things. All right. So I think the final piece that I'd suggest for now is that if this is a general purpose technology, then there is a big pie being baked globally in the economy, and that will have a massive amount of impact and opportunity and money going through of it. If New Zealand had a small slice of that pie in our tech sector, it could easily double or triple the size of that part of our economy. And so how we get a seat at the table and how we have businesses which are impactful in that emerging economy would be one of the frames that I'd sort of pay attention to. And I guess that's a quick, short summary. Really open to questions and Brett.
Thank you. In the practical sense, and perhaps with some reference to your point on a frictionless economy, is it your view that the use of blockchain is inextricably linked to cryptocurrency?
No. I would say that blockchain is a specific type of computer architecture which has become synonymous with this whole field. And you'll often hear people talk about blockchains, distributed ledger technology, because you can have types of computer systems which play in this space which don't use blockchains or cryptocurrencies. I do think the creating digital tokens is a really interesting dynamic which impacts some of the sector, but the general purpose technology is broader than that.
And just to sort of sum to that, it's not quite. Can you give some sense as to just how governments might use blockchain technology, not only for citizens' experience with government, but also for unlocking information for government agencies and government to make better decisions?
I think one really interesting use case, and this is where in the report I mentioned a trial that was happening in Australia around disability allowances, is that there's a lot of government services which look like conditional payments. We're going to give you some money and we're going to put some rules about how you can spend that money. And often you'll have agencies and rules and bureaucracies who say basically check in, did you spend it in the right way? They'll audit it, you'll have checks and balances. With the concept of programmable money, I can give you money, and when I give it to you, I can program it to say this is how you can spend it. So I can say you can only spend it for these things at this time with this person, and that's essentially what they're trialing in Australia with their disability allowances, which essentially gives people who are receiving government money much more choice and much more freedom, and it creates kind of a controlled market environment for suppliers and consumers to purchase the things they need in a way where you can have confidence that they're doing what you want with the money. So that's just one example.
Gareth and Clayton and Melissa.
Yeah, I think we talk about positioning New Zealand as blockchain friendly. Do you have a sense of what a potential roadmap could look like and which government agency should lead?
I would say that at the moment, literally, New Zealand is not on the global blockchain map. And that when you look at the reports of what's happening internationally, New Zealand doesn't get a mention. our industry is a fair way behind the 8 ball. I don't think it would take much for us to do something innovative and get on the map in a way. One opportunity I would say is that there is a type of, you mentioned cryptocurrencies and tokens. There's lots of different types. One type is a security token, which is something which is regulated by the FMA or someone and behaves more like a traditional security. And there aren't very many ecosystems where it's easy and able to launch those tokens. There is a window of time where if New Zealand and the FMA is in a really good position, the Act which governs them has given them good flexibility to actually become $8 fixed use case, constrain it in a way with the purpose of experimenting, exploring and innovating. I think if New Zealand did something like that, that would get a lot of attention and a lot of people looking to base their businesses here because of that partnership with the government.
Clayton. Yeah, thanks very much. There's a couple of questions. One is on taxation of cryptocurrencies, and I think there's a lot of understanding still to be, sought globally, but there is more and more understanding that the smart currency is the way forward. But there's questions around how do you tax it inside the cryptocurrency. Could you build in that matrix the fact that every time that currency is spent or moved or purchased, you can actually build in the taxation which would automatically pay to various governments, that tax component like GST, etc. Is that
absolutely?
So, currencies currently set up, cryptocurrencies that are currently set up, could you add that factor into them now moving forward, or is it too late? Is it
So yes, you can design. One way to think of it is programmable money. And so if you think about writing a rule such as I'm a cafe, someone pays me, GST goes straight to the IRD at the point of sale, reduces my compliance costs, makes it a much simpler business to run, helps the idea in a bunch of ways. That taxation at the point of transaction is entirely possible. You can do it in current systems. It depends on the system and the way to implement it. But I would say that it's one use case which is worth looking at.
Great. The next question is around about how blockchain could be used as a voting tool to get people involved. Has that been looked at as the opportunity to get more engagement, a very clear line around, so an unbreakable system essentially to be used as a voting system? Is that something that you've looked at?
Yep. So there are companies who are specifically saying what's the application of this for voting. When you get into whole electronic voting conversation is a bigger piece. There is one company, which was one of the ones I case studied in the report, called Horizon State. They were interesting to me because it was mostly an Australian company. The CTO likes New Zealand, lives here, brought a team of people with him, employs people because of the talent, the place where talent wants to live kind of idea. I would say that when I look at the use cases, electronic voting, that is one. There are people working on it. If you do some research, you'll find some interesting things. I would probably put it a little bit lower down the easy win sort of categories, because I think electronic voting's got its own issues. One quick tangent on that would be that the biggest challenge you see in the blockchain space is that people are building up these ecosystems which have a lot of value, and there is no one person who controls that value. So they're kind of looking at it's about the political system. They need to reach compromises, make people happy. If people aren't happy, they see the systems fork, which is a whole nother conversation. I think the expertise that people in politics and people in governance have is sorely needed in the blockchain industry. And there's lots of lessons to learn both ways on the role of governance and voting in an appropriate system.
Great.
Melissa.
Hi, a couple of questions. I was just thinking, security of information is actually very important. And I think more and more news organizations, with the advent of lots of fake news and AI-generated news, are concerned about that. And I think you see more global news organizations using blockchain technology. Have you heard any in terms of the way that New Zealand media is actually going in this? Are they open to it? Have you seen any? How do you think New Zealand media would actually sort of go about doing that?
I haven't seen too much in the New Zealand media space around sort of fake news and blockchain intersections. I do think that there is a lot of opportunities. One way of thinking about it is that with blockchains, you can essentially have people make attestations publicly and say, I think this thing is true. And when you start to design systems like that, it can be a solution against fake news, particularly as you start looking at the power of synthetic news and people making videos of people saying stuff they never said. That's one way to think about it. But the other thing about this technology is that I think it can be more powerful for privacy-enabled systems. Right now, if you have a Facebook and Facebook gets hacked, lots of data can be leaked out. The way you tend to build a blockchain system is that if you're Facebook, all the data you have from your people or from your users is encrypted, which means if someone hacks it, it's encrypted, they can't see anything. And this has quite significant impacts on privacy in the way you build things.
Talking about price.
Oh, no,
No,
sorry.
no, no, you've
Oh,
got
just
some.
because I understand there's some legislative change in the US around encryption. Is there some opportunities to attract some of those companies down to New Zealand?
I'm not aware of that particular change in the US around encryption. There may be. I think that you see a lot of blockchain companies are essentially global companies, and they will look for favorable regulatory environments to base themselves. And so you'll see people like Malta and Gibraltar having very permissive regulatory frameworks. And I don't think that's the direction New Zealand wants to go. I think that New Zealand's reputation for fairness and essentially being a highly reputable governance structure is something which is also sorely needed in the blockchain space. So striking a balance between permissiveness and, I guess, reputability. And the other thing is that I don't think many of these companies need exemptions to rules or specific rules made for them. It's just most of the rules that were currently written had no concept of this technology emerging. And so it's really about the accessibility to decision makers and governors to say, hey, how does this apply to us? Do we need a small tweak? If you look at, say, taxation, for example, it was mostly good enough, the legislation. Small tweaks are needed on GST, and that's a process that I believe is underway. If you look at the Financial Markets Act, that legislation was awesome in terms of giving the FMA the ability to adapt to this new technology. So I don't think any changes were needed there.
Going back to the question I had, how could blockchain technology be used perhaps by organizations or government departments like Treasury to secure their information?
I would say that...
Although this time it was openly available.
You just Google search, really.
Yeah. I would say that the exact nature of how would depend on the domain that you're in. But I would say that this technology does have a really unique sweet spot in terms of privacy, security, as well as accessibility. I think that, and this ties back a little bit back to the monopolies idea. So if you think about Facebook at the moment, really hard to compete against them, really hard to get the data, really hard to build a competitor, stifling innovation in the social media space because of that. If Facebook was built on a blockchain database, that data would be accessible to everyone. Anyone could get a copy of that data. It would just be encrypted, so they couldn't do too much with it. But if the users came with you, they could decrypt the data and get access to it. So if you wanted to compete with Facebook, you could take a whole copy of that database, build a new system, and if the users come, they can get value, and so you can have more competition while still allowing companies with positive network effects to succeed.
Okay, more serious question. How you talked about digital identity and the security of information for all of us is actually really important. You know, our privacy issues, everything. So how would you build the digital identity for all of us?
Cool. So I would suggest thinking of difference between protocols and applications. If you look at the early internet, the way email was sent, the way files were sent, the way the web was accessed, it was all about designing protocols. If you look at what happened on top of that, the Facebooks and Ubers and Airbnbs were building applications on top of those protocols. I would start to think about building a protocol where multiple players can build implementations of a digital identity attestation, and that they agree upon the protocol they're going to share that with each other. So we might have completely different implementations, but we're still talking the same language. So I would look at building a protocol for multiple providers to make...
Government departments.
Government departments. So that would be one thing. The other thing I would look at doing is what's the pain point that users feel at the moment that a digital identity would remove for them? And actually trying to solve that particular problem first so you attract people to use the system. Because it's easy to build this perfect system which no one wants to use because they don't get benefit.
Exactly, like real me.
And I'd say that that is the main way I think about it to start with.
Yeah. I guess in the future, could we see all government information on the blockchain, which means any time a citizen accesses it, it's discoverable, or useful. Is there a role for government to develop those protocols, or is any other government developing those sort of official information protocols?
Yes, so I would say that there's one of the places I saw was the Netherlands. They were doing lots of government initiatives on exploring bits and pieces of it. My sense is that one useful idea is that it's not a good idea to put all data on the blockchain. For example, medical records, you'd never want them on the blockchain. Even if they're encrypted, someone can decrypt them in the future and it's bad. But what you can do is put fingerprints of records on the blockchain so that you can still talk about that record and give people access to it. but you need to access a more secure system to actually get the data. And this is when you look at data sharing and so on. So medical records is a good example. I think a lot of government data would fit in this same thing, where it's more about showing people what data is available, who's touched the data, who's got access to it, how you can get tokens to unlock pieces of data while still keeping it secure.
Very cool. Excellent.
Could I
Well,
just stop on that?
yeah, sure.
Thinking about that, could I give an opportunity then to use, given that blockchain is all about disaggregating a transaction to tiny micro-element parts, is it quite possible in the future we could have a situation where, it's taken obviously not a political search request, but search for some information such as health trends, in particular, is a certain disease more prevalent in what sort of circumstances? And actually we could have a situation where through the blockchain in real time, very discrete and otherwise personal elements of information could be sourced separately through the disaggregated nature of blockchain, brought together as an answer without compromising either security or privacy.
Absolutely.
So using very personal, individual level data to give an answer that doesn't compromise that privacy.
Yep, and there are people working on the way to think about data commons, but I think that is the whole thing about how can you aggregate private confidential data in a safe way for people so that researchers and everyone in the society can access it and understand it and analyze it is a really strong use case. Just one thing, the other thing I'd say is that when you think about the role of data in society and who holds the data and who governs the data, I think that if you start to take a position which data actually belongs to all of us, and that there's a really interesting thing that happened in Los Angeles recently where they said, hey, Uber, you need to share your data. And if you look at a lot of those companies, they treat their data as their gold, like the Facebooks, the Googles, and Uber and whatnot. So this was a regulatory position, which is you need to share your data to access here. And I think if you start to think about that kind of intervention, if you want to change the shape of markets, or if you want to change the shape of governments, which is, hey, government agency, you've collected data, you need to share that data in a safe way, I think could become a new norm, which would be very interesting.
I was going to say that would also mean that we get rid of censors as well. Potentially.
Bigger question. I don't know much about the net dynamics. I would say that there's a tendency for people when they first see this technology, say, oh, everything can be on this. A little bit like electronic voting, like you can just see all the upsides, but there might be some reasons why you always want to do some things on paper, which I think should be considered when designing and thinking about these systems.
I understand that Bitcoin alone uses as much electricity as Ireland. Do you have any comment on that? And is there a way to separate this massively increasing electricity consumption from the blockchain?
Yep. So the early stage technologies, Bitcoin and Ethereum, used a protocol for keeping everyone in sync called proof of work. Very electricity intensive, very wasteful, lots of computers. No one really builds new stuff using those protocols, and some of those systems have got migration pathways off those protocols. So I think it's an accurate analysis. I also think it's probably not a big part of the future of the technology moving forward as people do more smarter ways of getting agreement.
What do you think government should do in terms of the support for the technology so it can actually progress faster? Because at the moment, no one's actually sort of talking about blockchain. Government departments don't know how to actually deal with it. When they actually look at Bitcoins and what have you, banks won't even open bank accounts with new startups who actually want to use the technology.
Cool. So this was why one of the main recommendations in the report was a cross-agency working group, just to help people in the agencies, one, pay attention, learn from people about it, but also because if you don't understand something, you sort of shy away from it. So just giving people a space to understand it more, come to grips with it, play with it, experiment with it in safe ways, I think would mean that they'd be able to interact with it in a lot more confidence. So pay attention to it, education around it. But then I would say it's about small experiments. It's about trying to solve real problems with the technology in safe ways, get them paying for themselves quickly kind of stuff, and then just follow your nose rather than having a big, this is our strategy and plan and off we go.
Excellent. Thanks for your time, Joshua. That was very good.
Thank you.
You're igniting our interest in a lot more. Thank you. Very good briefing.